From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our super producer, Andrew Triforce Howard. Most importantly, you are you. You are here. That makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. If you are hearing this the evening it comes out, folks, we are almost at the end of the calendar year, a time for reflection, a time when we look back and think, holy crap, how much stuff has happened over just the past couple years?
Everything's fine. Last couple weeks. It's all good, guys. No worries here.
Says the dog in the burning room, the cartoon dog. We're relevant. We're on point with memes.
It's making a big comeback, actually. It's very relevant.
Yes.
SNL just did it with Biden.
Yes, just so. And like the rest of the world, we, your faithful correspondents, are in the wake of an ongoing pandemic, something that fundamentally rocked the planet. Everyone is still trying to figure out what happened, how it happened, what it means for the future. And there's this continuing war of narratives and theories. And as we've discussed previously, people still argue to this day about the origins of COVID-19. Was it a naturally occurring zoonotic infection from a wet market in Wuhan? Was it a lab experiment gone wrong? This is a heavy, sensitive subject, even now at the end of 2024. Luckily, guys, we are joined this evening by one of the world's foremost researchers on this case, these dilemmas, these questions. The award-winning director, executive producer, studio exec, and creator of Thank You, Dr. Fauci. Folks, we proudly welcome Jenner Furst to the show. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you for having me, guys.
This is a real Jenner Furst for the show. Get it? Because it's the
Oh
first
boy!
time. Sorry.
Oh boy!
I'm really sorry. I'm really so sorry.
I really wish that was the first time, guys.
Of course it's not. It's like when people sing the first Noel to me, and I say, you're so creative and clever.
Because your name's Noel.
It's true. That is my. Ben, I couldn't help when you were doing that fantastic intro, just thinking about how I haven't thought about this stuff because it has not really been in the news a lot, since it was almost like overloaded when it was first kind of happening to us and then all of the kind of postmortem. But no one's really talking about this stuff as much as you think they should be. And Jenner, I can only imagine that perhaps led to your exploration to some degree, or, at least a moment when we need to hear about some of this kind of stuff, what may have actually happened.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think we hear about a lot of things and then we don't hear about a lot of things. And I don't think that's a coincidence, and I think therein lies the story, guys. It's a lot more than meets the eye. Let's just say that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
You have a track record, too, for anyone somehow unfamiliar. You are a 2-time Peabody Award-winning, 4-time Emmy-nominated director, and you have this cavalcade of diverse, impactful explorations of society that we could argue go across genre with one thing in common, telling us the stuff they don't want you to know about a given subject.
Oh, dude, the pharmacist?
Right.
Holy crap.
Fire fraud, big up.
Murders. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm just, the pharmacist Jenner, when I saw that for the first time, I was like, oh my gosh, this dude is my hero. Like, I immediately connected with the subject of that documentary. If you have not watched The Pharmacist, go watch it right now. And then immediately watch Thank You, Dr. Fauci.
And I can confirm, by the way, Jenner, Matt is telling the God's honest right there, because when Matt saw The Pharmacist, he reached out to us and said, guys, we got to check this out.
We talked about it on the show. It was so good.
Yes.
It's ironic. The Pharmacist came out in February of 2020. So,
are you serious?
Full circle right there.
There we go. Now, with that, now we're talking a little bit about context. So before we dive into the deep water, and we do have quite a few things we'd like to glean your insight on here. Jenner, can you tell us where you were at in life? What was going on in your head? What first led you to the creation of Thank You, Dr. Fauci?
Well, I think it's very interesting because actually when I had finished and premiered The Pharmacist, I had been contacted by these producers who wanted to attach me as a director to this film about Anthony Fauci's work in Africa. So this is 2020. He's just becoming a household name as the pandemic is starting to pick up. And I developed this project. I had his contact. I had done my initial research. We took the project out. This was about PEPFAR, an initiative in Africa which tried to stop the AIDS pandemic. It involved President Bush and Bono, and it was a pretty crazy story, and no one bought it. And so I went on and directed, I believe, 3 series during the pandemic. So I was very busy and I was very lucky. And my personal life and all the different things that we all experienced and suffered through, I experienced, but I was busy. And like I said, fortunate because my industry supported remote working and I was able to keep directing and people wanted content. And in late 2023, my attorney contacted me and said, there are these independent television producers. They have raised their own personal finances and they want to attach you to this project. They're looking for an accomplished director who will independently investigate a story. And before I tell you, I just want to warn you, it's controversial. You may find them crazy. I promise they're good guys and you should hear them out. And so I take a call and these producers, Louis Fenton and Scott St. John, they tell me that they believe that Anthony Fauci has done terrible things and that he lied, and he lied repeatedly. And, this wasn't a big shock to me. Unfortunately, I'm a very cynical person. I can't say I skipped a beat in the beginning of the pandemic when conversations about Wuhan began because it's logical, right? There's a laboratory in the same city where the outbreak happened. I believe that governments lie, that the media lies, all those things. But I had been whisked away like everybody else and, caught up in the craze and the dividing nature of this topic. I was vaccinated. I saw my own friend group kind of get fractured around that issue, my own family. I saw the politically charged nature of the story. And I found myself subconsciously aligning with a side of this story, regardless of the fact that I've been conditioned to accept everything that I would soon discover. I was manipulated into kind of just going with the herd, so to speak. And so I listened to them and I said, look, I don't do hit pieces. I don't do witch hunts. If you want to just do a takedown of Anthony Fauci, I'm probably not the right guy. Give me a couple days. Let me go and see what is out there as far as evidence is concerned, because I don't just want to jump in. I want to see where the reporting is to date, and I want to get back to you guys. I spent about 3 hours on the internet and immediately saw that there were almost 200,000 pages of evidence that had been released over the last 2 years since I was looking. And it wasn't the substance of this material that shocked me the most. It was that I had lived in a bubble where every major media outlet that I trusted, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, other major outlets like that, had avoided this story. They had avoided not just the reporting of the grants and the funding and all the different connections that Anthony Fauci and the United States government had to Wuhan. They had even avoided the bombshell grant proposal from 2018, which is before the pandemic happened, to do work on coronaviruses and essentially create a virus that looked identical to COVID, before the pandemic started in the same city that the pandemic originated. And so I was, I felt like a sucker. And that's what really got me looking deeper. And that's how I'm here right now.
And just to be clear, that is evidence that you found. That is not somebody on social media talking about this thing. This is research that you did in an actual piece of like primary documentation that you can find
These
that
proposals
proves that, correct?
exist.
Yeah, that's what's so shocking is that of course, we know there's a lot of talk on social media, and I think a lot of social media gets dismissed as just conjecture or, opinion. But this evidence, this actual source material, verified grant proposals, verified emails, freedom of information lawsuit materials that had been released drip and drab for 3 years straight, even that had been discussed on social media. And so, first of all, I was mortified that the paper of record, the, democracy dies in darkness, the Fourth Estate had avoided this story. And even more shocking to me was that they continued to promote a natural origin. And I started to see that a lot of these scientists who are out in front talking about the pandemic in this stratified landscape where if it's blue, it's natural. And if it's red, it came from a lab and Fauci is evil. And, just a very, very black and white story. But I started to see that who I had previously associated, who I'd been conditioned to associate with as a progressive, was getting the story completely wrong. And in fact, was potentially propagating a lie and doing so in a way that was absolutely horrifying to me. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw that it was way worse than I even thought.
Jenner, we got to get to it. You and your team have in-depth interviews with multiple experts. And one thing that I greatly appreciate, I think we all greatly appreciate about this exploration is that we're not introduced to what false dichotomies in media would call whack jobs or wing nuts or anything like that. One of the first folks that you introduce us to in this piece is, and you reminded me of this when you talk about seeing all these experts come up and make speeches adhering to a narrative. You introduce us to Dr. Robert Redfield, one of the guys who is not making a lot of universally propagated conversations about COVID, despite the fact that he is the director of the Center for Disease Control from 2018 to 2021. For a lot of us watching the film, Dr. Redfield seems to have some surprisingly strident differences of opinion and perspective from those of Dr. Fauci. Could you tell us a little bit about his contentions and a little bit about how you guys got connected?
Yeah, I mean, what I discovered was there was a community of people who had been on the inside of this story, who had investigated it, and who within the scientific establishment had fought Anthony Fauci, not just about COVID, but about a lot of things, about this really controversial form of research called gain of function. And Dr. Robert Redfield happened to be one of those people. And he happened to be in a very, very important role during the pandemic, at least when the pandemic started. And I was introduced to him from a very unlikely person. So as I began to fall down the rabbit hole, one person would introduce me to another person, to another person. And so, you get in touch with Richard Ebright, and Richard Ebright says, you need to talk to these people and you need to talk to Jeffrey Sachs. And so I talked to Jeffrey Sachs, who's a, renowned progressive left-leaning economist. And he says, you must talk to Dr. Robert Redfield, who was a Trump appointee and the CDC director. And so right off the bat, everything went against the political conditioning that we are all, supposed to have. And these people were united not about, some kind of commentary or opinion, but about the hard, cold evidence. And Redfield had been ostracized. And if you look at the press of the CDC director at the time of the original outbreak, at the time that the pandemic began to spread around the world, the CDC director and the CDC were blamed for a lot of the problems. And if you even look at Anthony Fauci doing press, he will say things like, "I'm just following the guidance of the CDC." And what I learned was it was the complete opposite, and that the CDC director, Bob Redfield, was essentially powerless. And that within that agency, HHS, you have the FDA, you have the CDC, and you have the NIH. And at the time, the HHS director was Alex Azar. But the person with the most seniority, who had been in HHS for the longest, who had understood that bureaucracy better than anyone, was Anthony Fauci. And I think for anyone on the inside, they knew that Anthony Fauci was the most powerful person. And so in talking to Bob Redfield, it was immediately clear that everything about this man, about this doctor, about this scientist, about his opinions, about the actual things that transpired in the early days of COVID was wrong. And that there had been some cover-up. There was a series of events that the public had no idea happened. And Bob Redfield is the most inside person. And not only is he an inside person to the outbreak and to the early days of the pandemic, he's someone who knew Fauci for 40 years. He was on the ground during the AIDS pandemic in the very beginning. In fact, he did a lot of very important work. And when we look back at history, it's very ironic because Anthony Fauci takes credit, as one of the heroes of the AIDS pandemic, but it was actually the opposite when the pandemic happened. And people like Redfield represented really good, honest, ethical science. He was one of the first people to say this isn't a gay disease. This is transmitted by bodily fluids. He was treating people in the army. And I think that I immediately understood that Bob Redfield had no interest in fame. He had no interest in parlaying his experience into a platform. He didn't have a lot of social media followers, and he didn't create a lot of wealth after the pandemic. He had no endorsements. He didn't work for a pharmaceutical company. He doesn't work for a powerful lobbyist group. He's just a doctor who was on the front lines of the pandemic as the CDC director, and everything he did and everything he thought was covered up.
Well, in the documentary, Redfield goes so far as to even express more than mild annoyance that Fauci kind of seemed to take it upon himself to become the spokesperson, more or less. He doesn't phrase it as though he's stealing his thunder. He just kind of says, that was a little interesting. He was very aggressive about putting himself forth to being the kind of poster child for this wet market theory, which was kind of the prevailing theory they were pushing that would go against this idea of a lab leak in Wuhan. Instead, it was the idea that this zoonotic, virus was created naturally, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, at one of these wet markets in Wuhan. Why do you think Fauci was such a good poster child, I guess, of this theory?
Well, I think that Anthony Fauci has an incredible bedside manner. And in addition to having an incredible bedside manner, he has a lot of experience in Washington and has weathered many different news events, scandals, movements in time, presidential administrations. He is someone who's, butter doesn't melt in his mouth, or at least that's what it looks like. And the reality is that Fauci has been the front man for an aggressive biodefense agenda for the last 20 years. And contrary to what liberal, progressive Democrats may believe, the man who gave him the most power in his career was Dick Cheney. And in the wake of 9/11, when all of these different rights and regulations and structures were being taken apart,
all bets were off.
With the excuse of terrorism, biodefense had the same filter. And it was the anthrax attack that put Anthony Fauci on a direct course to become the number one person in biodefense. The problem was there was no real regulation, and that Cheney had taken biodefense out of the Pentagon and the Defense Department, where it was heavily regulated, where there was a lot of compliance review, and he had given it to an agency where there was none of that. And billions of dollars went into this research. And there had been scientists fighting that, and even scientists like Redfield who witnessed this, whole transition, who were very skeptical and who felt like the research that was being done was not research that was going to make the planet safer, that in fact it was the opposite. It was research that was going to create more and more risk for everyone.
Because it's dangerous to contain, or some of these labs were not set up in such a way to have a robust protection against these potential leaks.
Biological weapons are weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. And unlike nuclear weapons, a biological weapon that could wipe out the human race can be created in a high school chemistry lab.
Right.
And that is just a scary reality that anyone who knows about biological weapons knows is true. And so there were these technological advances that made this field of biological weaponry and biodefense a lot more sophisticated. And we all know about CRISPR and, genetic sort of editing. This was happening in viruses. And, this has the potential to take a common cold and mix that cold with HIV, or mix, a bird flu with Ebola, or take some characteristics of one virus that transmits in a respiratory way with a virus that was never, airborne. And this type of research was popularized by Anthony Fauci. A lot of people were arguing that this was a Pandora's box, and that once you open it, you can't close it again. And that once one mistake could wipe out the human race, or could create a pandemic that, the world had never seen.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break, hear a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
We've returned. Let's dive back in. Jenner, what you just explained in very approachable terms for anyone unfamiliar is the idea of gain of function, right? Giving new abilities to life forms, be they viral or something else that ordinarily did not exist in the wild. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned here, because it's definitely a sticking point, not just on a scientific level, but on a deep philosophical level for a lot of the scientists and experts you interview, which is the binary or purported binary difference between bioweaponry research and biodefense research. At more than one moment, we see experts that you're speaking with seem like almost righteously indignant about the idea that, how did they put it in one conversation? The idea that the best way to protect against bioweapons is to research into how we make bioweapons.
Which is just making bioweapons at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's actually Redfield who says that.
Right. It's a lot.
That,
It's a lot like the fire department saying, guys, as the fire department, what we need to do is start more house fires, because that'll help us figure out how to put them out later.
Yeah, except, imagine that with, H-bombs, because, these are fires. Viruses have arguably billions of years more evolution than humans, and they evolve faster than we can even understand. I mean, obviously a virologist and a microbiologist, molecular biologist could tell you how fast these viruses evolve, but within days, within weeks, a virus can completely change. And so we're playing with organisms that arguably do things that we can't necessarily predict. And like many people have said, these scientists were playing God, or playing master of the universe, or playing master of evolution. And I think that is a dangerous concept, and really an archetype in science for years. I mean, this is one of those stories that is so essential, mythological. it's a fable, it's a parable. It's when you fly, it's Icarus.
Yes.
You fly too close to the sun, your wings melt. And that's essentially the type of work that Fauci was doing while enjoying incredible celebrity and enjoying the power he gained from being the largest funder of biomedical research in the world and someone who had a secret parallel budget with the Defense Department to shell out even more billions that were not recorded. And, it's ironic that after all that time, a pandemic happens, arguably from this research, and we are completely unprepared for the pandemic, which was the reason why this research happened in the first place. In fact, a lot of this research was connected to an mRNA vaccine for coronaviruses, which, the initiative sprung from the original SARS outbreak years ago in the early aughts. And for years, this idea that a SARS virus could be another pandemic or biological weapon or simply something to focus on in vaccine technology actually propelled a lot of the research that resulted in the pandemic itself. And so you couldn't have a more ironic and tragic closed loop system where the research that was supposed to prevent a pandemic ended up causing a pandemic for which society was not prepared for. And then now we are actually more at risk for another pandemic like the one that just happened because we never told the truth about how it happened. We never regulated a damn thing. And in fact, the lie about natural origin led to even more funding around researching viruses that come out of nature when in fact these viruses don't come out of nature, and that the next killer is not going to be a natural virus. It's going to be the result of the same research that caused the last one.
So one of the things we always like to do on this show is follow money trails, which is something you do here. And that's what we're talking about right now. Who were the individuals and companies that were inside that web of profiting, like to a ridiculous amount off of this terrible thing that happened?
You have a cottage industry of scientists who their whole careers were financed by Fauci's grants and by the other accomplishments and accolades created from this type of research. And of course, those scientists on an individual level, they want the research to continue. And then you go up the ladder and you have different biomedical and biotech companies that provide, pieces of a vaccine or provide pieces of technology that is very much benefited from this type of research continuing, and you have them on the food chain. And as you continue to go up, you have pharmaceutical companies, specifically in vaccine development, who almost all of their research is subsidized by Anthony Fauci and the United States government. They're getting money from the United States government to do this research, and ultimately they profit from this research, and all of it is subsidized. So of course, they're incentivized to want this research to continue. And then you have sort of an aspect of this equation that involves a lot of money, but is not meant to be seen by the public. And that's the involvement of the intelligence community. And that there's actually a connection between the intelligence community, venture capital, this research, vaccine development, and biotech companies. And so you have to ask yourself, how the hell is that food chain all connected ethically and without raising extreme suspicion from the average person? And there isn't a good answer for it.
And what else does it tell us about the larger context? We're so glad you're bringing this part up because this is a heck of a wrinkle. There is an alleged devil's bargain, or let me step back for a second and just highlight the note you made there, Jenner, about the funding and the origin of the funding. Fellow American listeners, that means you paid for it. Just a side note for that one. When we're talking about intelligence agencies, thank you, Dr. Fauci, there is this concept of what we could call a Faustian bargain, a devil's bargain, the idea that the United States, through various Matryoshka dolls of interaction gave the nation of China incredibly sophisticated technology and funded research. Tell us what you think here. As a way of aiding their goal of spying on Chinese labs, is that correct?
Well, yeah, of course, that isn't the story that makes the news. The story that makes the news is usually a story that doesn't even talk about that. But if you look back at the news that was happening around the time that the United States government was endorsing and supporting this research around 2014, 2015, you'll see this idea that science brings nations together, that science is the great uniter, that like the International Space Station, for example, this is something that all of our great scientists from around the world can do benevolently, and this can aid, international relations. And the reality is one that is far more sinister than that. And that when it comes to the greatest threats to humanity, it isn't nuclear weapons. It isn't what you see on the news about Iran and its nuclear program. It's biological weapons. And the new arms race that was taking place was between the United States and China, two world powers, one that was very dominant in this space and another that wanted to catch up, China, and wanted to advance an agenda and become a leader in this space, and did not have the same regulations as the United States, and did not have any interest in being compliant to the bioweapons treaty or any of these other safeguards, and that they essentially, the intelligence shows that they set very ambitious goals. And this was known in the intelligence community for years. And there was sort of this problem in China where they didn't have certain aspects of technology. They didn't have certain aspects of intellectual property or talent who understood how to use this technology. And they called that the stranglehold problem. And they ended up partnering with the French to build out the Wuhan Institute of Virology's Biosafety 4 lab. This was the most sophisticated lab in China to handle the most dangerous pathogens on the planet. And the French lent most of their knowledge and a lot of the technological expertise to build this lab, to train the Chinese on how to operate the lab. And ultimately, the French were kicked out at the last second before the lab was ready to be functional, and the Chinese assumed control of the lab. And this sent signals, I think, in the intelligence community that the Chinese intended to use the lab for bioweaponry and for research that was adversarial in nature. And this is around the same time that you see the funding to that lab from the United States increase. And where you see scientists who are highly suspicious individuals who run, quote, nonprofits like Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance start to do more research at Wuhan as a pass-through,
right?
As essentially something that can receive money from the United States government and then distribute it with even less regulation than the government had at the time, which was scant.
So yeah, it's a way of conducting this kind of research without being directly tied to it, or it's almost like a loophole to get around like the Biological Weapons Convention, which essentially prohibited development, production, acquisition, stockpiling of biological and toxic weapons. Like, is that the idea, that this sort of gives this layer of plausible deniability, or what?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, and that's what it was from day one. So even before you have what is going on in Wuhan around 2017, 2018, you go all the way back to 2001, around the time of the anthrax attack, when, we began to do this research aggressively to make a, quote, vaccine for, or to stockpile vaccines for potential weapons agents. Mm-hmm. The loophole is by design. In order to make a countermeasure, you have to create the agent itself. Yeah. And so as long as your research is defensive in nature, it's permitted in the bioweapons treaty.
Or appears to be. So
you can make defensive measures, but those could involve the creation of an offensive agent, and that is kosher.
So let's talk about a very specific instance of this, that it's a proposal, or comes to us in the form of a proposal that was sent to DARPA in 2018 by EcoHealth Alliance. It was a proposal that was rejected. I think you mention it in the documentary as the diffuse proposal, or what do they call it? DC sign, I believe.
No, it's the diffuse proposal, which was drafted by EcoHealth Alliance with the contributions of Xijing Li at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and Ralph Barrick at UNC Chapel Hill. And these are really the main players in this story. Underneath Anthony Fauci is this web of scientists who were doing research at Wuhan or who were connected to Wuhan. And this proposal predates the pandemic and outlines essentially a blueprint for how to create a virus that looks identical to COVID-19 in its sort of effect. And of course, plausible deniability is to, look at every little nuance of the actual virus, which has evolved countless times since it was released. And, for people like Fauci to say that, well, this has no connection whatsoever. Sure. And of course, it was never funded, which we also believe is a lie.
Exactly. So this this research was meant to insert furin cleavage sites in SARS viruses, like, as you're saying, a blueprint for what SARS-CoV-2 became. And can we just hit really quickly on why that furin cleavage site is so important to the genome organization of this virus and
what that is and what it might indicate, right?
So what gain of function does over time is identify different aspects of a virus or an organism that contribute to a key function. And if you want to add that function, if you want to gain a function, you use certain attributes. And furin and the furin cleavage site is very complex and something that I think a layman may have trouble understanding. But the simplest way to explain it is that this is a component that was well known and understood to make viruses airborne, respiratory, and very, very infectious. So if you took a virus that maybe didn't have an easy time transmitting in humans, if you added a furin cleavage site, you would have a very infectious virus. And that, I think, is really the first smoking gun in the story, because as the outbreak is happening and as it's becoming a global pandemic, the genetic sequence is released by the Chinese and it has this immediate sore thumb sticking out, which is the furin cleavage site. Many scientists pointed to that and they looked at the genetic comparison of other coronaviruses that were similar. And there were a lot of anomalies. The most striking one was this furin cleavage site. It had not existed in this way in any other virus. And it essentially made a virus that was spring-loaded to infect humans. And so the whole logical, explanation for this being a natural virus started to fall away for a lot of people, including Dr. Bob Redfield, because you have a virus that immediately is infecting humans when, if it was natural, there would be several evolutions and there would be a way to track those evolutions in other animals, other host species, and ultimately into humans. And instead, you had a virus that wasn't even infecting bats, that was being blamed on bats, but was essentially transmitting like wildfire. Bob Redfield says he believes it's the second most infectious virus in history. And it's being blamed on a bat in a wet market, and there isn't even evidence of where that incident occurred. Meanwhile, by the time we were reporting it, little did the world know, this had spread around the globe probably 3 times by then. By January of 2020, this virus had most likely gone around the globe multiple times. And so the furin cleavage site, to kind of tie it all together, the reason why this virus was so infectious, the reason why it was an airborne virus, and the reason why it was so suspicious is because it used this thing, this tool, this attribute, which was well known in gain of function, to make it that way. And scientists on the inside knew that on day one.
We'll pause here for a word from our sponsor, and then we'll be back with more from Jenner Furst.
And we've returned. Let's jump right back into our conversation with Jenner.
And this is where we get to the idea of narrative war, right? You mentioned Daszak or Pete. I don't know him well enough to call him Pete.
It's a lot of different pronunciations. People have called him Dr. Evil.
Yes.
I believe the actual FOIAs, there are scientists who are making essentially a fraudulent science paper who call him the Grand Wizard of Phylogeny. He is quite a interesting guy.
Fraud, the F word, right? Sorry.
And that was what you're referring to there is a statement from Neil Harrison, a PhD who didn't want to use the F word being fraud. This is interesting, Jenner, because we've already sort of alluded to this idea of, again, narrative war of experts in their field, world-class experts who are somehow sidelined in the race to figure out what the F is going on. With our guy Pete here, I'm particularly interested in the role he played. It seems like there are maybe multiple roles in getting together a group of scientists who would march in lockstep with the wet market conclusion or the wet market theory. And there's a lot of time spent in, you and your team and your partners find some pretty disturbing internal communications. I'm thinking specifically about folks like the investigative reporter, Emily Kopp, leading so many charges on FOIA requests. Could you tell us a little bit about why some scientists felt they were excluded from this quote unquote inner circle and why other scientists seem to be totally fine jumping on things like that open letter from the Lancet in February of 2020?
Well, I think that people like Dr. Peter Daszak were really the ones that were so compromised that it was others who had to do the work of covering up their mistake. Yet people like Daszak, of course, were out in front with this natural origin theory, never disclosing to anyone the work he had done at Wuhan, never disclosing, of course, the proposal that outlined creating a virus that looked identical to the one that was infecting people around the world. And I think it's pretty obvious that the folks on the inner circle, when you do the actual digging on these folks, they all had conflicts of interest. They either received money directly from Anthony Fauci's agency in the United States government to do research involving gain of function, which was, of course, the most controversial aspect of this research that people like Fauci did not want to talk about. And many of these people who signed the Lancet letter, for example, have direct ties to even vaccine technology, biotechnology, research, pharmaceutical companies. And so you see this media campaign essentially for 3 months straight. And this is while the virus is continuing to spread around the world. And this is while we are confounded by the virus's attributes and we don't know what it's doing and we don't know how to treat it. And of course, that is a horrible, horrible, misleading idea here that we don't know about this virus because there was research into this virus and aspects of this virus and the virus's attributes for close to a decade. And if there had been an honest conversation amongst all of these scientists, and if they had been willing to acknowledge what was staring them right in the face, which was evidence that this had been manipulated in a lab, evidence that many of the grants, many grants, like over 20 grants to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to Dr. Ralph Barrick at UNC, to a lot of other scientists who were actually involved in these teleconferences, would tell you how this virus behaves and would give you a leg up for treating this virus, including countermeasures, which were somewhat successful at treating the virus, that were not vaccines. And yet for months, there's one story that's hitting the airwaves. The virus is natural. It just hit us and, out of the blue, smacked us in the face. And we've been warning you about this type of, natural phenomenon for decades now. And it's exactly why we do this dangerous research, so that we can understand these things that are just going to come out of nature like, a bolt from above. And we're just scrambling to figure it out. So please be patient and trust the science, because we're just trying to figure it out right now. And it was actually the opposite. The only thing they were trying to figure out was how to carry out a cover-up, which would essentially obscure or hide all of the connections that these individuals had for years to this work, and all of the culpability that they had for the pandemic happening. But the problem is, unlike a traditional fraud or a traditional crime where you can really narrow down a set of suspects and you can, put culpability down to, who drove the getaway car and who held the gun and
who wrote Proximal Origin.
Right. Who covered for who, and, you can, get people in even a RICO case, like in the mafia, you can put a bunch of things together.
Sure.
This makes the average mafia case, look like child's play. I mean, this is levels and levels of culpability, of connection, of benefit, of potential harm to sectors that or lobbies that have extreme power in the United States. You have a lot of people all standing to lose something from telling the truth, and you have a lot of people all standing to gain something from telling a lie. And so you just have a perfect storm, and ultimately a crime that becomes too big to prosecute. And that's where we are now. But these individuals did the early work, and these individuals set the stage and created the master narrative, the big lie that would get repeated for years, and ultimately got the media in line and got even the United States government under Donald Trump in line to enact this cover-up and to essentially launch warp speed and to give these pharmaceutical companies complete and total protection, no liability for damage. And all of it was based on a lie. And if we are to really step back and look at that, the damage is inconceivable.
I'd love to name some of those guys. Just put it like, do we have a list of people from like those early Slack communications and those early connections that we could just say their names here, where people can start looking up?
Of course. So you have an initial flurry of emails between Sir Jeremy Farrar, Fauci, and Francis Collins, who is the director of the NIH, ostensibly Fauci's boss, although Fauci has been there a lot longer and appears to have a lot more power. These three individuals represent nearly $75 billion in funding every year.
Wow.
And Jeremy Farrar is like Fauci's equivalent in the UK. He was the director of the Wellcome Trust, and that was one of the largest funders of biomedical research in Europe. And these individuals were corresponding on emails, for which you can see. Just Google emails between Anthony Fauci and Jeremy Farrar.
Heavily redacted, though, right? I mean, isn't that?
Well, originally they were heavily redacted, which is something that was, of course, very suspicious, especially how long they were requested. And the first batch that was released was redacted. But by now, these emails have been unredacted because there was no legal reason why they should have been redacted in the first place. Right. And that essentially the NIH was engaging in obstruction of justice and essentially continuing a cover-up, despite the fact that they legally needed to release this information. But back to the story. So in early January, right after New Year's Eve, you see a flurry of emails. And then you see scientists start to have conversations amongst each other after this genetic sequence is released to the public. And that's in early January, January 11th. And by the 27th of January, Fauci gets contacted by a scientist named Christian Anderson. And Anderson is based in California and does a lot of research on viruses like Ebola and Lassa. He worked with a laboratory in West Africa called the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium. And he contacts Fauci and says, this furin cleavage site is very suspicious, and this looks like it may have come from a lab. And by the way, I found these grants that basically show almost instructions and or components of this virus, and they were funded by the NIAID. And the work happened with Ralph Barrick back in 2014 and 2015. And Fauci responds by saying something along the lines of, if this is true, then, you should contact the FBI.
Right.
Meanwhile, Fauci is continuing to field panic and start to do some damage control. And then on the 31st of January, you've had all these emails, this kind of concern that this is going to get out of control and that there needs to be essentially a story right now because this could affect a lot of us. And you're not going to see them, dump their guts on emails because they are seasoned bureaucrats. I mean, it's like the mafia. They don't talk on the phone. Watch The Sopranos and Tony doesn't let you say anything on his house line. Fauci was the same way about his email account. I mean, if anything, he put things in his email to try to protect himself, to make it seem like he had genuine concern or he was genuinely trying to get to the bottom of what happened as if he didn't know already.
Oh, geez, says the guy dressed as the hot dog. It could have been anybody.
That's just basic corporate training etiquette, for email. Like our lawyers for our company, tell us the exact same thing. Be really careful about what you say because that's the stuff that gets pulled in for lawsuits is usually these kind of email conversations.
And imagine that times 10 because now you're dealing with American bureaucracy and the federal government and Congress and all of these things that Fauci was well aware of. So however he, got there, whatever, however he scraped his knee in the past, he was very well aware on how to discuss things over email. Although he made a lot of mistakes. And if he hadn't made those mistakes, we wouldn't be here right now. There's still plenty in those emails that's suspicious and that raises a lot of questions. But you have this turning point and you have these conversations happening online amongst accomplished scientists who have a background in this field and who can call it like it is and look at this genetic sequence and Google and use the research databases that they know exist and go and find grants that are doing research that is very suspicious compared to the outbreak and in the location where the outbreak happened. And so this is starting to crescendo. And then on the 31st of January, there is a number of different articles that come out, but there is a preprint of a paper. And this paper advances the original suspicions that existed and says, yes, there is a furin cleavage site, but there are 3 other regions of this genetic sequence that are suspicious and do not seem natural. And we have found in our crunch of the genetic sequence in comparison to all of the other genetic sequences that exist for these viruses, we have found fragments that are suspiciously similar to HIV. And this is when the panic begins to articulate and get even more frenzied. And Fauci is up late at night scheduling an emergency teleconference. And by this point, Bob Redfield has had numerous conversations with Anthony Fauci. He's the director of the CDC, and he has talked to Fauci directly about his feelings about this virus, that he felt it came from the lab in Wuhan, that he felt it wasn't natural, that he felt it was spreading in a way that was uncontrollable for a natural virus, and that he also was aware of research that was funded by the United States at the lab to do work that may result in a pandemic just like this. And on that night of frenzied emails inviting scientists like Christian Anderson, who at first was somewhat of a whistleblower, who shows up saying, hey, Dr. Fauci, this virus doesn't look natural. And Dr. Fauci goes, that's, great observation,
right.
Dr. Anderson. Well, if it's true, let's call the FBI. Well, Anderson gets invited to this teleconference along with a lot of other scientists that have a lot to lose if gain of function has another scandal. But the CDC director, Dr. Bob Redfield, does not get invited to the emergency teleconference. Right. And so you have the director of the NIH, Francis Collins, you have Jeremy Farrar, the guy who is, the Fauci of Europe, and you have these scientists who do this work, in fact, are famous for this work.
I'm going to put these names: Robert Gary, Eddie Holmes, a couple other dudes.
Christian Anderson loops in 3 scientists that he works closely with, and those scientists are Dr. Bob Gary, who also does a lot of work in West Africa around viruses like Ebola and Lassa, and even did a lot of research around AIDS and HIV starting in the 90s. And you have Eddie Holmes and Andrew Rambo. Again, these are scientists who have been in the community for a while doing this type of work themselves, but also have ties going all the way back to the HIV research being done in the 90s to try to understand origin and understand the virus better. These were people that Fauci knew, that Fauci had funded, and whose work he was familiar with. And you have some scientists who really have no reason for being there. The only reason they maybe were there were to argue why this was or wasn't gain of function, why this was or wasn't a lab leak. But they weren't doing that objectively, because this scientist, for example, this guy, Ron Fouchier, was one of the most controversial scientists in gain of function to date. He had been funded by Fauci to make avian flu, bird flu, airborne. And bird flu, has like a fatality rate that can be anywhere between 10% and 50%. And there has never been a huge human-to-human spread of bird flu. It does occur naturally, right? It does,
Jenner, really quickly, Fauci in a press conference references a paper or a study that is, as far as he's concerned, is proof positive that no lab leak occurred, that this was, something that supported the Wuhan wet market narrative. But he's like, I don't remember the names, and it seems really sus. Right. It's odd. And it's just, I don't know.
Yes,
what's
it's
the
very
deal
odd.
with that? Does he ever actually drop what it is? Like, do you guys get to the bottom of that, or is it just sort of a vague statement? Okay.
You rewind 3 months, and those scientists who he says he doesn't have the names of are the ones that he summons to an emergency teleconference. Right. On January 31st, he begins the emails. On February 2nd, that teleconference happens. So you're referring to a press conference in April where Donald Trump was present and where there is a lot of concern now about this being a lab leak. And Fauci holds up a paper. It's called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. That paper was written by Christian Anderson, Bob Gary, Andrew Rambo, and Eddie Holmes. There were a bunch of other writers, but those 4 guys happened to be in the teleconference on February 2nd. There's another teleconference that we didn't even know about that happened. It's February 1st that this teleconference happened. So if you have to go back, and the date is February 1st. Fauci is, panicked on the 31st of January, and by the 1st of February, he gets everybody together for a teleconference. On February 3rd, there's another teleconference. And this one actually includes some of the scientists who may be responsible for the pandemic. And this was never disclosed to the public. And these scientists were never even credited on that proximal origin paper. And essentially, you had scientists who were either famous for gain of function research and or involved in the actual creation of a virus that may have caused this pandemic, who are present and who are interfacing with scientists who are writing a scientific paper to prove that this did not happen in a lab and that this was natural. And so you can't think of a more suspicious set of facts than that.
And I think you put it very fairly there at multiple points. We'd love to ask a personal question of you, Jenner, if it's all right here.
Sure.
All right. So you're coming into this like so many other people across the planet during the, let's say, the emergence of public knowledge of COVID, right? If we want to be technically accurate there. When you have dived into this, are there questions that you personally right now would like answered, or questions that remain unanswered at the culmination of your research here? And then secondly, we just have to ask, man, did you ever feel that you were in danger looking into this, or ever in fear of some kind of possible reprisal?
Yeah, I've told stories where I feared for my life, and I've told a few of them, and the nature of the threat was different each time. And I think when you go against the intelligence community or you go against the pharmaceutical industry, you can find yourself in the crosshairs. But in my experience and my, understanding the space, that unfortunately it's the bravest and the first to respond, the first to break important information, or even eyewitnesses, whistleblowers. They're the ones who die first. They're the ones who are killed first. And I was coming to this story late, but I was the aggregator. I was the person connecting a lot of this research and a lot of these sources together. And I quickly realized that I was being monitored, or at least I felt I was being monitored. There were weird things happening with my devices, and I had some very strange Zoom calls that I was getting thumbs up and balloons and all sorts of things on very bizarre lines. And I started to have an evolution where I understood that maybe I was being monitored, but that it appeared that who was monitoring me was in support of my thesis, and that it was a very bizarre thing that happened. And so I began to realize that I was not going to be killed, and I was not at risk of being killed. And that kind of melodramatic story that journalists, like to tell. In this case, I was safe. But that the greatest risk for someone like me is that there will be people who come into your life and convince you that they have a lot of evidence that you should know about, or that you need to talk to this one person because this one person has it figured out, or actually it's not Anthony Fauci, it's Francis Collins, it's not that, it's this, or, that is the risk. Because for someone like me, who you can Google and who has reached, over 1 billion people with my work, has been seen by over 1 billion people, it's been on major platforms, that the name of the game is not killing me because my crew is too big and that it's too many people know I'm making this movie. The name of the game is misleading me and getting me to include information that isn't true. And what I began to understand is that I was being supported by people potentially within the CIA. And I had a background source in the CIA whom I cannot disclose any information about. But what I can say about this individual is that they endorsed and supported the data that I had collected and the hypothesis that I had formed around this data, and that they believed that I was on the right track, and that the biggest thing they wanted people to know and the American public to know is that most of the people in these agencies, the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, the DOD, these are patriots, for lack of a better word, people that believe they're serving our country and that they're protecting us from threats that we'll never know, and that they believe that they're honest people and they're hardworking people, and that the corruption is really at the top, and that they want more than anything for that corruption to be routed out, for that corruption to be annihilated. And so I found by the end of the story that the people that I may fear the most, the CIA, the intelligence community, they're the ones who are going to off me, were actually individuals who supported my efforts.
Allies.
And that was the big twist for me when I realized that this was a story that made for a lot of strange bedfellows and created strong alliances and strong collaborations across political lines, across agency lines, and that a lot of these people were simply soldiers of the truth. And I found myself in a similar role, and I think it'll be a war that I'm fighting for the rest of my life at this point, because the folks on the other side are quite powerful and they have a lot of tricks, and things are actually just getting started. So I hate to say something like that. I hate to say that, oh, we figured out the truth now and there's protections in place and this won't happen again. It's the opposite. And you asked me, what did I learn? What did I discover, from making this movie? I learned how much I don't know. And I am hungry to learn more about what happened with COVID. But watch for the biggest distraction. The biggest distraction is going to be the quote smoking gun. And the reason why that's the biggest distraction, when did the virus leak? What is the incident that caused that leak? What is the exact composition of that virus and the proof that that composition was man-made? You'll never find that. Okay? You will never find that. The serological data about the virus was never released from the Chinese. We don't know what the earliest, illness looked like. We have a genetic sequence, which is essentially just a computer, set of letters, right? And the reason why that so much attention is put on the exact origin of this virus is because that's the part that the most powerful and sinister individuals know that they've gotten away with. The crime that you can prove right now is that there was a cover-up, and that the individuals engaged in a cover-up are engaged in a lot of sinister activities around the globe, that these activities involve war games, that they involve pharmaceutical industry essentially abusing the public for years, and they involve what could be another pandemic that will cause even more societal change, even more profit, and even more, I think, destruction to the fabric of our world. And that is the thing that we need to focus on right now. We need to focus on the clear evidence that a bird flu will likely emerge sometime very soon. You can see the fingerprints in the media. You can see stories about bird flu emerging in cow milk and crossing over. And that's a distraction. In fact, I think that is them perfecting their toolbox, because the last time they did this, it didn't work. Okay. And proximal origin was too obvious, and the wet market was too obvious of a lie. And now for months now, we've been seeing about, bird flu crossing over in these isolated instances. And that is really preparing the stage for the next pandemic and for us to believe that it was natural. It will not be a natural pandemic. It will be a man-made pandemic. And that is what we should be focusing on. So watch carefully. If you continue to see a story emerge about the exact, genetic proof that the virus came from a lab, you are actually being distracted, because that is the part that they are most confident about. They are most confident that you'll never be able to prove that. That's why Anthony Fauci stood there with so much bravado and so much confidence in front of Congress, because he knew he got away with that part. This is the part they didn't get away with. They covered it up. The evidence is there. It's right in front of us. That's the crime. And the next crime is going to be 10 times bigger than the last one.
What a mic drop. Well said, Jenner.
Just to put this in perspective, Jenner, roughly when did you interview Dr. Redfield?
I interviewed Redfield in February of 2024.
Okay.
So I began working on this project in December of 2023. And I fell down the rabbit hole and began interviewing folks, and had done most of my interviews by the end of the spring of 2024.
Okay, because something that rings in my head all the time is his statements about bird flu. And again, thinking about what we see in the news with H5N1 and how Redfield seems to be very confident that bird flu is the thing that is coming for us next. I think he uses the word premonition or something to that effect.
That's right.
But ultimately, he sees that as the thing that's coming. That is really, you have that belief now as well, because we've been talking about it on the show, and it does just feel like a strange, set of circumstances.
Statistical certainty.
With some of the little stories we've been seeing, right? Look, little drips and drabs of cases kind of on the upswing.
Yeah, and even there has been an increased funding for gain-of-function or gain-of-function adjacent work on avian flus since the pandemic. And that individuals who were in that teleconference are the most famous individuals for setting the stage for that bird flu pandemic, that man-made catastrophe to hit the public. That individual's in the teleconference with Fauci and the others right in the beginning of COVID. So you have to ask yourself, once you can see this puzzle, because that's the part that they work so hard on, is for you not to have the puzzle pieces. And that's what the film does. And if you think you know the story of COVID, you don't. Because I made a documentary about it and sifted through 300,000 pages of evidence, and I still don't know the exact story of COVID. And if you think you're over COVID, that is a manipulation. You are being conditioned to think you are over COVID so that the crime is never solved. And so that when the next one happens, you will forget what happened this time. So when you see people who are in a malaise and don't want to talk about COVID, COVID's over, the pandemic's over, the pandemic ain't over. Okay, we're all suffering from one form of long COVID or another. And I know that sounds crazy for all of us who think we're healthy. This virus continues to affect our bodies years later. This virus may have pieces of HIV in it. This virus has caused a mass autoimmune dysregulation in the public of the planet. Okay.
And isn't it also true that Dr. Redfield's specialty for his private practice now is long COVID?
Dr. Redfield's now specializing in long COVID. And this was, I think, the full circle for him. He was there in the early days, and now he treats people with long COVID. And I think, again, a huge distinction between Dr. Redfield and Dr. Fauci is that Dr. Redfield is a doctor, okay? And Dr. Fauci is a bureaucrat. And Dr. Redfield cares about patients, and Dr. Fauci is still concerned with his power and his legacy and probably getting final payment for his deeds, which couldn't have been issued during his time in government. He received roughly $7 million in security from the United States government after he retired annually. Okay, more than that. And long COVID and vaccine injuries, which are very similar to long COVID, will continue to haunt us for years. Some of us will struggle with this for the rest of our lives. Redfield and others believe they can actually reverse a lot of this and that it's not some complex, high-cost medicine. It's actually enhanced antihistamines and, anti-clotting agents and doing MRIs to learn where blood clots may be happening in your body and essentially helping the immune system regulate again. And, this is a frightening thing for a lot of people. But while I was making the movie, the person who I had hired to be my main researcher dropped out within a week because she had aggressive stage 3 breast cancer out of nowhere. She was in her early 30s. The one of my producers, their mother died right before production of an aggressive lung cancer that went from 0 to stage 4 out of nowhere. She went to an urgent care because she thought she had pneumonia. She never went home. She was unconscious within a couple weeks and dead. My partner in my company, while we were making this movie, his mother died of a sudden heart attack, and he is confident with his other siblings that that was caused by a blood clot that was essentially a reaction to the vaccine or the virus. I have 2 relatives right now with aggressive cancers that got them out of nowhere right after the pandemic. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, and you notice that there are people in your community that are sick or drop dead or that have cancers in ways that you didn't notice before, I think it's time to ask ourselves those hard questions. And that if we think we're over COVID, we're just fulfilling the propaganda that was fed to us, and we're actually feeding it to each other. That was the scariest part for me. it's not that I was the victim of state-sponsored or corporate-sponsored propaganda. It was that it was so effective that I was feeding it to others organically, others were feeding it to me, and that I'd be willing to have a fight at the dinner table when the person that I was, likely defending was the United States government or a pharmaceutical company. Think about that. Think when you fight about this and you think it's political, think who taught you how to feel that way and who gave you the playbook, and think of the fact that instead of them paying for it, you're not even being paid. You're not an influencer. You're not carrying that message out. It's so damn effective that we spread it amongst each other. That's how effective this propaganda is that we spread it amongst each other. And that's like, Hitler level propaganda. Okay. That's another level. And we're all suffering from it. And we need to wake up. This is something that Democrats, leftists, progressives, all the people who have been fighting for, government reform and consumer protection, wake up. This is our fight too. This is not just conservatives and people on the right. In fact, the political nature of this is the core manipulation. It's not political. It affects everyone on the planet, and only the 1% of 1% benefit, while the 99.9% of us get harmed. It's time to tell the truth now.
And propaganda is viral when successful. Propaganda only acknowledges any ideology in such that it allows that propaganda to further communicate. I think these are very real, very dangerous questions, and they're questions that need to be asked. A lot of times, to your point, Jenner, about the nature of mass media communication, we, the public, are taught that an answer should be simple. An answer should be deliverable within 3 to 5 minutes. You get the answer, you feel better, you move on to the next thing, be that celebrity scandal or be that to the next crisis. So we cannot thank you enough. There is so much that we have not been able to get to, but thankfully,
have you on again, guys.
Yeah.
This was just part 1, right? I mean, it's a 3-part series, right?
Seriously,
guys,
thank you. You're being so generous with your time here, man.
I got to tell you, when we started rolling, I got a message from an unknown number that just says hello. And just now, I got another message from another unknown number that just says hello. Just putting it out there.
They don't want you to know, right?
There we are.
I'm serious.
I believe you.
Before we get black bagged, again, we want to thank you, Jenner, so much, not just for thank you, Mr. Fauci, but for all your additional work and perhaps most importantly, for continuing to spread awareness and continuing to be a clarion call for these very difficult questions. Could you tell our audience and everybody else who wants to learn more where they can learn more about you and your work?
Well, my work exists on major platforms like Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Paramount Plus. But this particular film, the greatest way to learn about it is through our website. And you won't find it in a lot of media reporting right now because it's actually a tough subject for the media because they were involved in helping to cover it up. So I want to give credit to you guys because as a purveyor of truth, as a podcast that is listened to by many people, you are doing the good work right now in helping this story get out because we have experienced a media blackout for almost 4 weeks now. Press release went out to 5,000 outlets and no major outlet, no international outlet, no big national news outlet covered the story to date. And so I want to thank you for having me. People who want to learn about this film can go to thankyouDrFauciMovie.com, and that all of the ways to watch the film are there, that our social profile on X is really the best way to stay connected. That's the only platform really allowing for a free and open debate right now and where we have the most presence. So you can find us on X at Thank You, Dr. Fauci, and you can find all ways to watch this movie at thankyouDrFauciMovie.com.
What a ride. You guys, I know we've all seen the documentary here. Again, as we were saying, there was much, much more to the story, but I think we unanimously commend Jenner and his team for the research they've done.
Yeah, I've been hyping it up to some pals since we did the interview. It really, it's one of those things too where it's just like, these are things that all of us have thought about, and he gives so much credence to a lot of these narratives that it's really hard to ignore, at the very least, thinking about what some alternatives could be to the narrative that has been sort of more or less forced down the throat of the American people.
It does make me wonder how many people actually clicked on this episode and have made it this far, because this is such a politically charged topic, or, it was turned into such a political topic rather than a science topic.
Right. A narrative war. Yeah.
Yeah. So I hope anybody who's still around and hearing this right now is fully considering this stuff. Look at it on your own. That's kind of what the whole point of this is.
Yeah. And I believe that we all on the show unanimously feel the same way. And folks, we don't have all the answers. We definitely want to look at the facts and objectively apply critical thinking to sensitive and heavy subjects such as this. We can only do so with your help. And that's why we would like to ask you to hang out with us on email, on a telephonic interaction, or even on the internet, online.
Correct. You can find us all over the internet, all over your platform of choice, at the handle Conspiracy Stuff, where we exist on Facebook with our Facebook group, Here's Where It Gets Crazy, on X, FKA Twitter, as well as on YouTube, where you can find video content galore to enjoy. On Instagram and TikTok, however, we are Conspiracy Stuff Show.
We have a phone number if you want to call and give us your 2, 5, 20 cents. Call 1-833-STDWYTK. When you call in, it's a voicemail system. You've got 3 minutes. Give us your name, like not your real name, maybe a fun nickname, and let us know if we can use your name and message on the air. If you've got more to say than can fit in a 3-minute voicemail, why not instead send us a good old-fashioned email? We are
the entities that read every piece of correspondence we receive. Be well aware, yet unafraid. Sometimes the void writes back. Send us the links. Send us the pictures, the puns, the near-death experience stories. That's going to come in handy later in our Third Man Syndrome episode. Most importantly, be well, stay safe, have adventures. Join us out here in the dark. Conspiracy at iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.